Okay, so we are now recording. Today we are going to be talking about zero tolerance and the school to prison pipeline. These are two different ideas that correspond with each other and really relate to each other. So we're going to just talk about them together instead of doing two different presentations on each one. So first we have to define these terms because you probably have not heard of them. Um, so first we're going to talk about zero tolerance. This is either in schools, this can be in immigration, this could be in lawmaking. This is all over the United States politics and criminal justice system. So the definition that I chose to go with is a school policy that's giving severe consequences to any student who brings a weapon to school or threatens the safety of school. A school policy given is, oh, it's repeated. Well, oops. Okay, so that's what zero tolerance policy is. That's the first chunk that we're going to talk about. The second definition that we need to talk about before we get into anything else is the school to prison pipeline. So this is where we talk about um, why the zero tolerance policy is bad, because in theory that sounds really good. We don't want to have students in the building or people in the building that are creating harm for our kids. That's not the goal of school. That's why we have the zero tolerance policy in place. So in theory, good idea. Maybe will work. Let's try it out. But this is what the reality of the zero tolerance policy is. The national trend where children are funneled out of public schools and into juvenile and criminal justice systems. Many of the children have learning disabilities, histories of poverty, abuse, or neglect, and would benefit from additional educational and counseling services. Instead, they're isolated, punished, and pushed out. So that's the second chunk of the presentation. So we're going to go in and first talk about zero tolerance and what that is. First off, zero tolerance started with the war on drugs. So the war on drugs was started by Nixon. This is a time in history that is still kind of continued where we decided as an American people we are going to crack down on drug use, drug possession, all of that. We have crack cocaine. We decide which drugs are we going to have more punishment for than others, and we plant them in neighborhoods. So this is where we have a lot of minority communities getting pushed off into jail for possession of drugs, which were placed in their neighborhood to be sold and used to gain money to be able to have a living. So we see mass incarceration start of minorities, lots of Hispanic, Black Americans being sent to jails for life because of possession of tiny amounts of drugs. So this still goes on to today. This is still an idea today that we have lots of people going to jail for drug laws that don't really make any sense. And now it's become more into schools. So we've pushed this more into schools and it's moved to schools. This can also be called the war on drugs is also directly correlated with the war on kids, the war on youth. And that's kind of what we're going to be focusing on, even though the whole issue with mass incarceration really revolves around minorities and those with disabilities. It really revolves around them. We're going to be focusing on the school aspect because we're about to go back into school, and it's just something to be aware of as we move into the beginning of the school year. So really, the beginning of needing zero tolerance at schools was not because of drugs, but because of guns. Because the first school shooting that was really well publicized and really well known by the media was Columbine High School, where students were killed in a mass school shooting. So now parents are calling the schools for protection from other people outside of the schools and protection from other students. So we don't want people getting in with guns. We don't want any more. We don't want shooters. This is the start of the active shooting drill and lockdown drills, where we practice constantly what's going to happen if someone walks in with a gun. What happens if someone decides to shoot up our school? Here's what we're going to do. And this is something new to our generation that we are used to. So this is where the idea is getting down and hard on bringing weapons to school, bringing anything dangerous to school begins. We need to have some protection in school. Parents are begging for protection, and this is their plan, was to just enforce zero tolerance. So this is a system of having consistent punishments at certain public schools. So it's like a chart is how I imagine it. It's a chart saying Oh, Billy brought a knife to school. So because Billy brought a knife to school, he's suspended for 3 days. It's just that correlation, the constant punishment for a specific crime or a specific broken rule that has equal punishment for all is the hope. This is in theory to make schools safer, have severe punishments for students who bring guns or weapons to school. Um, so this cannot be argued by any parents. I can't get suspended I can't argue getting suspended or not because the consequences are listed out in our code of conduct books that are published to the public. So we are going to be looking at our student handbook, which is where ours is published, and also our board meetings, which also states the zero tolerance policy at our schools, just to show that Hilliard even has this law in place. So this has been adapted by most school districts in the USA. Strict policies led to police SROs in the school buildings. So that's why we have our student resource officers or the police officers that roam our buildings are there. And that's kind of a sign that our school will be affected in the school pipeline. We do have zero tolerance because there's a police officer there who can arrest people at any time for any consequence that they seem necessary. So um, so another aspect of zero tolerance is the lack of rights for minors. So we talk about school administrators are able to spontaneously search students at any time as well, um, which is not necessarily legal at in like real world. You can't just spontaneously be searched when you're an adult, when you're at college, well, depending on your college, at public colleges, you probably can't. And when you are driving and you get pulled over, you cannot be spontaneously for no reason searched just because they feel like it. That's not a thing. But it is if you're a minor in a public school. So we are going to look at the board's zero tolerance for Hilliard City Schools right here. So here it is. It's just big old file right here. And how this is kind of created, for those who don't really know how school decisions are made, is over top of our superintendent, over top of everything in our school, to get everything passed by a school board. Now, the school board is parents in the district, people in the community who care about education. They do not have to be teachers. They probably shouldn't be teachers. Um, they cannot work in the district, but are people who are parents, who care about learning, who care about their students. They are voted in to make these decisions for the school in public meetings. And so every year we rediscuss all these zero tolerance. We rediscuss like the budget. We rediscuss how many teachers we could hire, and that's all on them to do. So I found this, if you look in the school board section of the Hilliard City Schools website, that's how I got all this information. So basically what this says, without reading it all, is the board has a zero tolerance for violence, disruptive harassment, intimidating, bullying, or any other inappropriate behaviors by its students. So this is really the way that the school is stating we are going to have harsh punishments for all of these things. I think these are very loose. Um, they make them loose so that you can catch a lot of different. It's not too specific, so you can't not catch some bad behaviors through it. So my example is I could pick on a kid saying that he has a bad haircut, and they could tell their mom, and their mom could go to the principal and get me in big trouble because I bullied. Even though it was like a one-time thing. I probably shouldn't be suspended for it. I could be talked to, I could get a detention, but not necessarily in need of a suspension. And that's how the zero tolerance policy works, that it over exaggerates crime, it over exaggerates the punishment needed for children and school age kids. So it does identify that it is listed in the school handbook, the student's code of conduct, um, to make all the students aware of the fact that the violation of this code is punishable, and it applies for any code of conduct that we deem necessary or that we deem bad. And so that's all guns, violence, all of that section. This is drugs right in here. This literally says if you have it, you're going straight to a juvenile judge and suspension or expulsion of the student. So, and this, as you can also see, is not only on your person, in your locker, this is also in your vehicles in the parking lot. Just because, they can search your car at any time as well. These are all things that we need to think about when you're at school is like, although although this isn't good stuff, you shouldn't be bringing drugs to school. I'm in no support of doing drugs or bringing drugs to school. The punishment for students having drugs in their car, on their person, that could be falsely planted, that could just be, next to their car in the parking lot because someone was there doing drugs the night before. It doesn't mean that that student committed a crime or did anything, and it leads to kids going straight from in their class to a juvenile detention center or jail. And that's not what the goal of school should be. And by the numbers of kids that they find under these rules, it shows that it's just not productive in our school system. So that's the board's policy, going through that. But there's also, we're going to go through the code of conduct as well because it does list out the punishments and how they're going to work them. The only different one that they do not state is the drugs, which was mentioned in the board position. So I always love to tell I have a younger brother and I like to talk to him about minors' rights because I like to make this joke, which is actually not a joke and it's very true, that minors don't have any rights. We do not have any rights, and these are our 3 rights at school, not including any IEP students, 504 students, any disability laws, because those are a lot different than just these. These are the average student's rights at school. A student has the right to a quality education and a responsibility to put forth their best effort during the educational process. Students have the right to expect school personnel to be qualified in providing a good education, and students have the responsibility to respect the rights of others, students, and all persons involved in the education process. So really, we have the right to learn and to have teachers that were trained to be teachers. Not a lot. That means they can do anything else they want. There are other things that go into this that are more court-based, but this is this is your bare minimum rights. These are really what you get when you go to school. So then this was all found in the student handbook. The rights, the first offense, and the second offense that we're going to talk about, all found in the student handbook. So if your first offense, I bully someone, I call them a mean name, their parents call the school, I get called to the principal's office, the first thing I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to call my parents. I'm going to have to say, oh, I done messed up. I'm in the principal's office for bullying a kid. I'm sorry. Then I could get detention, an after-school detention, a late or a lunch detention. Then you can get downgraded for your work because your honesty and integrity gets hit, right? And loss of privileges. So I could maybe not take electives, get kicked out of clubs, get kicked out of leadership positions, like lose parking privileges, average stuff here. But you get some consequence for it, not only just the detention. Then that changes a lot when you get your second offense. You also have to contact your parents. You get a suspension, in-school suspension or out-of-school suspension. That's what these 2 things next to it mean. Same thing where you might lose some credibility with your work and you lose privileges. I also think the administrator can move the second offense at his or her discretion. So I could come in for my first offense and say I bullied someone, and I can immediately get a suspension. Immediately, because that's their right. I don't have any right saying that they can't do that, and it's stated in the handbook that they can. So I have no right to say that you can't do that. And so they move it up or back however they want for students that they like or dislike, which is another shown of justice, inequality in schools. So the next part of this is the school to prison pipeline. So this is what happens because of zero tolerance. Because we have zero tolerance, there's a school to prison pipeline, and it affects students of color, low income students, students with disabilities or special needs, or LGBTQ plus students. So I'm going to show you guys, or I'm going to show you this video. Let me get the volume up too.
Oh, I think I've seen this video before.
Nice.
I watch Fox News a lot.
Here we go. Tell me if you, or give me a thumbs up or
I can.
Prison pipeline. It's shorthand for how schools are funneling students, especially black students, into the criminal justice system. It started in the 90s when schools responded to fears about crime with zero tolerance policies, which mandated suspensions and expulsions for certain violations. They also cracked down on little things like talking back or uniform violations. The hope was that it would keep bigger problems from bubbling up. But as a result, out-of-school suspensions have doubled since the 1970s, and they keep increasing even though juvenile crime rates have now been dropping for years. Around the same time, the number of police officers stationed full-time inside schools has increased by a third between 1997 and 2007. Ostensibly, they were there to prevent mass school shootings like the one at Columbine, but they end up being a way for schools to basically outsource discipline to the police. Schools with officers have 5 times as many arrests for disorderly conduct as schools without them. Sometimes the results are shocking. But the less visible effect is that schools are feeding the racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Consider the fact that schools are more likely to have an officer on their campus if the student population is more than 50% black. You might assume that that's because there's more crime at these schools. But although students at police schools are more likely to be arrested, they're not actually more likely to be charged in court for weapons, drugs, alcohol, or assault, at least according to one study. During the 2010-2011 school year, 1 in 6 public school students in the U.S. were black, but they accounted for 1 in 3 arrests at school. Same goes for other forms of school discipline. Black students are suspended or expelled 3 times more frequently than white students. It actually begins in preschool. 18% of preschoolers are black. But if all preschoolers suspended more than once, 48% are black. Studies show that differences in behavior can't fully account for these disparities. Black students and white students are sent to the principal's office at similar rates. But black students are more likely to end up with a serious punishment. One study found that white students are more likely to be suspended for provable offenses like smoking or vandalism. Black students are more likely to be suspended for subjective offenses like talking back or insubordination. Students who are suspended in school are more likely to later drop out or get arrested. So the federal government is asking schools to make suspension and expulsion the absolute last resort. In Oakland, California, public schools are trying something called restorative justice, where both parties in a conflict talk it out with a counselor instead of relying on punishment. The results are pretty encouraging. In the last 10 years, chronic absenteeism is down and graduation rates are up in the schools that have tried it. Other cities and districts are also trying new policies. They're hoping that if their students end up in the criminal justice system, at least it won't be because the schools pushed them there.
Okay, that's just kind of a little bit of background knowledge before we go into all of this. I liked how the video stated it. If schools are trying different methods on restorative justice, and I might do another video on restorative justice and transformative justice another time, but these methods that aren't zero tolerance related lead to a better system of education and ends the school to prison pipeline. So students who get suspended are more likely to drop out of high school. That's important to know as we look into all these punishments because, like we said, if you have possession of drugs at a school, you are immediately suspended or expelled. So if you get caught once or twice and you've had other suspensions, you are way more likely to you're way more likely to drop out of school than students who are welcome and stay in school the whole year, other than when they choose to go home. 25% of students who get suspended could qualify as special education or have a disability. So this means that we aren't taking care of our students with disabilities, students with learning or physical disabilities, and they're struggling and failing in our public education system. And we believe that the belief is that schools handle punishment and hand out punishment equally, which, as we said in the video, as you see in the chart in our image, that is wrong. That is not handed out equally. White students are way less likely to be suspended for minor or major violations than our Black minorities peers. So more on that. The criminalization of youth starts happening. So we talked about how it was overall the war on drugs that brought a lot of criminalization to the country, but then it hit youth. And so now all these people are saying the youth are bad, they're scandalous, they're doing bad things, making it harder for youth to find jobs and succeed. Students often get punishment for punishment's sake. Just because a teacher or parent complains about a student or what's going on in the schools will then punish that person just so that it can look good to the parent or look good to the teacher rather than actually taking care of each individual child. 3 million students are suspended every year. Suspensions take away one of our only rights as a student, which is the right to learn. That is huge. How many kids are getting suspended in or out of school, and how that just takes away the right to learn and says you are not worth teaching. It's just sickening in our public education system in this country. Students will leave the schools either with a diploma or a criminal record. There is an in between. I'm not saying there isn't. I'm just saying that since we have so many police in the schools, and since we have so many people watching and so many people wanting to punish the youth, it's hard to graduate if you've been suspended so many times. If you've been suspended so many times, you are more likely to end up in a criminal record going out of school than a diploma. School, another point I want to make that a lot of people don't think about is school's not only a place to learn. One thing that I've learned when I'm doing some research on education is that you really need to revolve everything about education on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So that means students need to have their bare minimum needs to live required before they can do any learning. So that means students need food, water, safety, like a shelter, and to feel loved before we can ever teach them anything. So if you are suspended and you go home, your house doesn't have any food for you, and you're suspended for a week, and and the only place you've ever gotten food is from school, you're not eating for a week. That child is going home and not eating for a week. That kid's going home to an unsafe house for a week. The kid's going home not learning, not getting love from teachers, and not eating and in an unsafe home for a week. That's really damaging to mental health. That leads to a lot of other issues that will come back to school. And school is no longer just a place of learning, but it's a place to live rather than just to learn. That's what you remember when we see the 3 million students being suspended every year. What does that suspension look like for each of these students? This is why it hits low-income families much more, right? What does it look like if I get suspended? It looks like I'm just coming home for a week and I'm just going to chill out at my house and watch Netflix. And I have food, but for some kids, I have to figure out what I'm gonna do now, or I don't have a house and now I'm out of school and I have to find some place to stay all day. What am I gonna do? And so that's really important when you see that 3 million students. What does it look like for each student? Because it won't look like what I would experience for every student that has gotten suspended. So really what the goal of this whole thing is to protect kids. It doesn't do that, but they want administrators to give out fair punishment, which it doesn't do. They want administrators to have uniformed ways of dealing with punishment, which, I mean, it does have that. And it's because America is so focused on, you can see this countless times, we're so focused on blaming someone and getting them punished for an action than we are in their individual needs. So I'd rather, like, the goal of the mindset of America is I'd rather see you punished for doing drugs than I want you to get the mental health help that you probably need for why you started taking drugs in the first place. And so that mindset has followed us into our education buildings, and that is why we see so many kids going off to jail rather than getting help that they need. So how does this apply to us and what we do at school? That we could have forced locker searches at the drop of, like, just because my principal said I'm having a bad day, I go into a classroom and say, I'm looking in your locker, come on. It doesn't matter. We don't have any rights. There's the presence of student resource officers, so we have police in the schools with guns who could, bring their own police brutality in, who could be undertrained and not know how to communicate with students, who arrest students on the spot. One example that I read, there's tons of examples of the school to prison pipeline. One that I read was they had to walk out a 10-year-old girl in Oregon, brought a pair of scissors to school as her school supplies for her arts and crafts project that day, and she got sent down to the police station, in which her parents had to fight for her release. And that just takes another kid out of school for a day. Who knows? Didn't state in the article that there was other punishment, but it was just a pair of scissors from a 10-year-old girl who probably didn't mean any harm. This then leads to the mass incarceration of youth. This leads to more minorities, more Black and Latino people going to jail, lots of disabled people going to jail for no good reason other than they had issues in school. And so the question that I ask everyone is, have you ever seen someone get escorted or arrested by the police in your school? So personally, I've seen multiple arrests at our school. I've seen people who went straight from a classroom to being handcuffed and walked out of the building. I've seen a lot of these things, and that's okay if they've done a crime, because I obviously do not know what had been going on. I just see it in the hallway, and I've also seen fights where I'm sure there was a much larger reason on all of this, and people can't stay in school if we're actually causing violent harm. But there does need to be some consequences, but we need to make sure our consequences are right for the action. So here's kind of, does it work? No. It's been proven to be more harmful to students than our restorative practices, and it causes distrust between students and teachers. And then the next steps for you to take, if you want to learn more, if you want to do something about it, zero tolerance is happening everywhere. I think Hilliard does a pretty good job about not over punishing or punishing too hard. I think Hilliard is a pretty great school district to be in, and has great policies and practices. I think that we should not have SORs in schools, demand the removal of police officers from schools. Know your rights and fight for them and fight for others' rights. When we talk about people getting suspended over silly little things, like I saw someone got suspended for bringing a plastic knife into school. Just saying, hey, maybe there's a different way to handle this than going zero tolerance. Maybe we could do a discussion on it and see what the intent was, and helping fight for other people's rights as well as your own. And then also, this is a really great book, Push Out. It's pictured below here. And it talks about Black girls in school and the criminalization of them. And it brings out some statistics. If you want to learn more on the war on kids and the war on drugs, there's also a video that you can watch on YouTube called The War on Kids. And it's also very informative and educational. Those would be the best ways that I see you learning more. Again, we have a great school district that does not rely on zero tolerance, but uses it as if something really bad happens, what are we going to do? But, there are so many school districts that aren't like that, and it's good to know what's going on in the world and be able to protect our fellow students as well. So that is the presentation. Here's all my works cited. There's a lot. So be keeping your eyes open for injustices at school and outside of school and being able to use your voice.